Over the years, so many people have discussed the ending of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's one of the most famous endings of Season 2, only eclipsed by Bart the Daredevil and probably Lisa's substitute. Most of the discourse revolves around whose fault this whole thing was. Was it entirely Herb's fault? Was it Homer for being an idiot? Most people come to the conclusion that it was both of their fault. But I think what is most interesting about the story, and its ending, is its framing. Herb Powell most certainly ruined his business, but Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is fundamentally about how Homer ruined Herb. This is a story about Homer. In some respects, this feels like the backward approach. Who gives a flying crap about how this situation made Homer feel? We just watched an entire business fall apart. But I think this framing is the episode's secret sauce. By following along with the quote-unquote wrong protagonist, we end up getting the most perfectly balanced view of the situation. There's something cosmically tragic about this adventure in how it builds and builds and builds from such a small, inconsequential place. This episode literally opens with a funny McBain sequence, poking fun at the action movie cliches. It turns out Grandpa went to see this McBain movie, didn't like it, and that's what caused his heart attack where he tells Homer about Herb. The whole story happens because Grandpa went to the movies. It's interesting how they use Grandpa, both as a source of exposition and as a thematic device. From a characterization standpoint, I absolutely love this version of Grandpa. How frank he is about going to the carnival to check out the ladies, his matter-of-fact remark about the things she'd do, like have sex for money. And then when Homer tearfully says Grandpa kept him because he loved him, Grandpa replies with, interesting theory. Grandpa is kind of a dirtbag, and it's amazing. He just doesn't give a crap about anything. But more importantly, Grandpa kicks off the overarching theme about Homer's worth, in comparison to Herb. The question of whether he kept the fail son or not. Obviously this was a false choice, in that he gave up Herb first, married Mona a year later, and then had Homer. This didn't all happen at the same time. But the story is able to use Grandpa's perception to push the narrative of two diverging roads. Later, Grandpa's begging Homer to not do something stupid and ruin everything. Grandpa views Homer as a screw-up, and that's how the episode wants us to view him too. I appreciate the choice to lean into the enthusiastic and passionate side of Homer's personality in his search. There's an endearing dopiness to his quest, how he'll melt down in the middle of a gas station, or start pleading to this orphanage guy. Even an otherwise boring phone call sequence is dramatic and interesting because Homer wants this so very badly. They still sprinkle in that sharp-tongued and annoyed Homer throughout, mostly in how he deals with his kids. But in terms of the brotherly relationship, they keep things as agreeable as possible. Both Homer and Herb want to meet each other badly, and when they do, they hit it off immediately. In some respects, this episode feels like the mirror image of Homer's enemy, in terms of the Homer-Herb dynamic. Oddly enough, Frank Grimes and Herb Powell do have a lot in common, in how they were both abandoned by their parents, and then worked exceptionally hard to make a life for themselves. But while Frank Grimes struggled and ended up working for Mr. Burns, Herb Powell got into Harvard and started his own business. When Grimey meets Homer, he hates his guts. When Herb meets Homer, he loves him and his family immediately. Grimey only sees Homer's flaws, and it results in his downfall. Whereas Herb sees none of Homer's flaws, and it still results in his downfall. Unlike Homer's enemy, which takes a darker, more cynical view on human nature, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou takes the breezy and optimistic approach. Herb Powell is the realization of the American dream, this baby adopted in Michigan that rose up to become a multi-millionaire. Suitably, this episode puts up relatively few barriers for any of its protagonists. Homer runs into a couple speed bumps in finding his brother, but is otherwise successful in everything he does. When they arrive at Herb's house, the family has free reign to do whatever they want. Now you could argue that Oh Brother, Where Art Thou struggles in its back half because it lacks conflict up until the very end. That this is effectively a glorified hangout episode. I think that criticism is somewhat valid. I mean, hanging out is basically all the other Simpson family members do. But I would argue that it's functionally important. The narrative effectively splits into two halves, the Homer car plot and the Herb family plot, and the ending doesn't work without both halves. The only thing Bart and Lisa need to do in the story is be super charming and likable to their uncle, and by and large, they achieve that goal. I love Bart and Lisa's banter, how they open with the dinner table argument and childish pantomime, how they continue to argue about boating and pony rides to Unky Herb. Bart and Lisa can be so abashedly themselves in this episode, and Unky Herb loves them for it. We're not given a ton of specific background about Herb and why he needs this so badly. This boardroom scene does much of the heavy lifting in the exposition department, describing the company's current market position, as well as Herb's backstory working his way to the top. He also confesses what a lonely man he is. Why is Herb so lonely? Herb's confession about his loneliness does feel abrupt in the context of this scene, but I like the mysteriousness of this characterization, that the episode lets the audience fill in the blanks. Herb has a huge mansion, but presumably never married and had kids. Or if he did marry previously, maybe he's divorced now. With Herb's passion for his business, it paints a picture of a man who spent his entire adult life working and never made those connections. It's yet another thing he has in common with Frank Grimes, that workaholic attitude. But unlike Grimey, who worked himself to death just to live between two bowling alleys, you wonder, what the hell, Herb? Surely as CEO, you went to so many business parties and social events, and you never once met someone special? Herb had so many social advantages as a rich man, could surround himself with hand-picked people, and yet he still finds himself lonely in a giant mansion. Once again, none of these details are given to the audience. The loneliness confession is doing so much of the heavy lifting here, but it does just enough that you implicitly understand why Herb falls for the Simpson family so hard. They make sure to sprinkle in dialogue where Herb declares Homer the richest guy he knows, to underline this element. Gotta give Danny DeVito so much credit for bringing Herb to life. He brings the perfect amount of high-energy dynamism and easygoing wit to the character. In all these casual scenes with the family, DeVito has that conversational charm where you just enjoy listening to him bumming around with Marge. On the business side of things, he perfectly conveys that Herb Powell can do anything, the way he gets in Homer's face and hypes him up. Herb needs to be likable for this ending to work, and Danny DeVito does a wonderful job. Another reason why this ending works is that they foreshadow it well. But unlike in Homer's Enemy, which is full of sinister motives and intrigue, this episode never fully tips its hand. For example, when Homer is tearing down the designs and delivering his bad ideas, they don't punctuate this with ominous music stings or dramatic pauses. Instead, they're content to let the comedy do the talking. We can laugh at all of Homer's wacky ideas and his extreme self-confidence. To be fair to Homer, some of his ideas do have functional merit, like addressing the cup holder problem for America's oversized soft drinks. But when you have Homer demanding bubble domes and firing this poor engineer, you're almost at the edge of your seat wondering what this dumb car will look like. They were also smart to keep Herb involved in this storyline, that the episode makes it clear that he was warned about what is happening. The audience can't walk away saying, Herb was totally oblivious. No, Herb was given a definitive warning from his lead engineer. But because he was too enamored with his half-brother, he would rather wield his power to impress the kids. And, once again, they're masking all of this via their comedy. We are heading toward destruction, but it doesn't feel like we're heading toward destruction. The episode makes the audience feel as wealthy as Herb, just enjoying the view from the top while stuff happens below us. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou definitely has a lot to say about the class divide, the dramatically different points of view that the working class have from those Harvard eggheads. It neither condemns nor idolizes either group. It's clear that these executives are painfully out of touch with what the common man would want, something Homer intrinsically understands, but also portrays Homer's ideas as boorish and impractical. Herb exists as a bridge between both groups, since he is new money, so to speak, but instead of being the best of both worlds, he totally biffs it. He surrounded himself with Harvard eggheads and blissfully ignored what the charismatic outsider was doing. I suppose this is a good place to discuss the jokes as a whole for this episode. This is a pretty good example of Season 2's brand of humor, where they experiment more with the bouncier genre parodies and a silly Homer commercial, but are otherwise sticking to their character-driven approach. I had mentioned some of the bratty Bart and Lisa stuff earlier. This is such a Season 1 and 2 kind of joke for them. but also just joyously childish stuff, like Bart singing, "Bastard, bastard, bastard, bastard," or them rolling around on the floor laughing at Itchy and Scratchy. The ending gets all the love because of that stupid design and Herb's huge reaction, but honestly, the orphanage is my favorite scene of the episode. First, the Dr. Hibbert meta joke, then the hilariously layered back and forth between the two of them, how Homer just can't take the hint. The way he taps the folder knowingly and exhaustingly gives up in the end. It's so well done. Feels like the prototype of the "Hello, Mr. Thompson" joke from Cape Fear. This thing is just filled to the brim with early Simpsons vibes, and I am here for it. How the individual scenes are so relaxed with its pacing. Every scene is allowed to breathe. We don't always need some wacky wordplay or cutaway to keep us engaged. Director Wes Archer fills this thing with charming and unique visual choices that make it feel extra dynamic. How this cop will swing around with his gun in the foreground, how it reverses and shows him from Homer's POV. Later, when meeting the kids, looking down on all three, with Maggie falling down. Little details like Bart quickly sticking out his tongue. And of course, the decision to keep Herb's face hidden from us until the limousine window reveal. Then at the end, we not only get a hilarious design for the car built for Homer, the animators even make a 360-degree spin of this monstrosity. Man, what a challenge this must have been to draw. One of the coolest things about this scene is how utterly deflating it is, both for the audience and the narrative itself. The story just builds and builds and builds and builds to this reveal, but the moment it happens, everything is immediately over. They don't do a prolonged sequence in the media about Powell's Motors' newest flop or whatever. No, instead they immediately cut to the Komatsu logo coming in and the repo guys in the background. Honestly, I can't think of many other Simpsons episodes structured like this. The episode immediately dies alongside his business. Get on the bus, Herb. But once again, this is Homer's story and not Herb's, so it caters its ending directly to Homer's footprint on the story. Grandpa returns and yells at Homer for screwing everything up, and Lisa provides the summation that Herb's life was an unbridled success until he found out he was a Simpson. I like this Lisa line, but it has always reminded me of her conclusion from Bad Dream House. Way to Lisa-splain these episodes to us, Season 2. The early days loved this idea of the Simpson family being these lovable losers. This black hole that drags down everyone to their level. When you look at it from that perspective, it makes sense why Oh Brother Where Art Thou is structured the way it is. Even still, despite Homer screwing things up, they add the tiniest bit of catharsis at the very end. That Bart thought that Homer's car was cool. God, this episode of Season 2 is hell. Like, this scene is the ethos of early Simpsons. These lovable losers that find solidarity with each other. It's such a ridiculous cliche in the grand scheme of things, but I like how the early years were so committed to stuff like this. We have been through so much stuff with Herb, but this is fundamentally what they want us to care about. This episode made me realize something about my feelings about downfall stories. That my favorite versions are the ones told from a third-party point of view. Sure, we don't get the level of intimacy of following the downfall character as the protagonist, but instead these versions take a much more relationship-driven approach. Our POV character gets to come in from the outside, and we get that top-down, holistic view of the tragedy. Like in The Great Gatsby, how we get Nick Carraway basically falling in love with his new friend. We get to watch alongside Nick while he is amazed and horrified by what happens. And the tragedy ends up imprinting on our POV character and the audience. The same thing happens with Herb. We will never know about Herb's full backstory, but we do understand his motivations, and it's crystal clear why he fails. The fact that this whole story is built upon his newfound love for the Simpson family, that fulfillment of his needs, makes his downfall even more tragic than Frank Grimes in my opinion. At least with Grimy, you could argue that he screwed around and found out. When Herb lashes out at Homer at the end, it's a dagger to the heart, because we know how earnestly Homer pursued everything. I think that's why we, the audience, are so keen to reevaluate this episode, and point out that it was Herb's fault for ignoring the warning signs. We don't want to see our Homer get beaten up by the narrative. We can laugh at Homer and watch him get yelled at by Grandpa and Herb, but also know that it's kind of bullshit. Homer didn't ask for any of this. This isn't a balanced episode because it evenly doles out the blame for Herb's failing business. that's not what Homer's character arc was about. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a great downfall story because it not only tells the tale of how Herb lost his business, but also how Homer lost his half-brother. But sure, Herb, let's play the blame game instead. That's really what this episode is about. Now get on the bus and don't come back. Dang it.